Well, thank you everyone for joining today. It's going to be a lot of fun going through these three paths that we have to talk a lot more in detail. Obviously, on kind of the background on why you should be considering these options, because I think that there's a wide variety of experiences that a lot of our prospects and a lot of our customers have had going through an upgrade process with Dynamics AX. So today, what I'd really like to do is just give you as much knowledge as possible to help educate you in terms of really the identification of what path you should be potentially leaning towards. This content has been actually created by our delivery team. Paul Chair, I wanted to give a shout out to as part of the beginning at this webinar because he provided me with a lot of the content to go through this. But this is a topic that we commonly tackle, obviously, during a what we would classify as a new opportunity with a client that's already existing on Dynamics AX. So like I said, we're going to try to give you as much information today. Feel free to ask as many questions as you have, and we'll be more than happy to answer them. So really, to first start here, what is our agenda? So I want to introduce myself so that you understand what my background is and where I came from. We want to go through some of the symbol and definitions that we're going to be looking through as we go through this presentation. So, some of the tidbits that basically are inside of here that are really important and very strategic when it comes to your planning process to determine which path you should be taking. Then we're going to dive obviously into the determine your best path. There's a wonderful infographic that we will be using as we go through this process to really identify some of those areas and what we typically see as what we'd classify as best practice planning when looking at doing an upgrade. And then finally, we're going to be ending obviously with questions. So if you have questions, feel free to ask as we go through this entire process. So the first thing here is who am I? So my name is Scott Frappier, as Alex had mentioned. I am a pre-sales architect at Stone Ridge Software and one of the partners. I joined Stone Ridge Software about 7 years ago now, focusing initially on the Business Central application, but moving into the enterprise solution with finance and operations and also with Dynamics AX. I have tons of experience, over 20 years in ERP. I actually graduated with a biology major focus and somehow made it into accounting software systems. But the net result is that I've been a developer, I've been a BA, I've been a project manager, I've owned my own business, and I've got a lot of experience to be able to give to you today on how you should be looking at going through your upgrade life cycle. So with that, really the next step here is to understand what symbols are we going to be looking at when we look at some of the content here today. So as you see on the screen, any of these symbols, we will be talking about some of those ideas and concepts, those shortcuts, and some warnings so that you really understand where are some of these opportunity areas as we go through this particular process. So without further ado, let's go ahead and show the wonderful infographic that you guys have probably seen in the past. This is the determine your best path that we put together at Stone Ridge Software with the help, obviously, of our delivery team, our marketing team, basically a huge collaboration between the teams internally to take content that really should be considered during an upgrade process and really bringing it together in a very simple and easy to understand concept on how you should be looking at going through this particular process. So these four main points that we're going to be going through today really drive how you do your upgrade, what you should be looking at, what processes you should be planning for ahead of time before you really get to that number 4 that we have on this particular screen of really choosing those different types of paths that you would do as part of your upgrade process. It's very atypical in our industry to have someone that knows your entire organization initially if they haven't been a partner with you for a prolonged period of time. It's something that we see sometimes where you will be in a competitive situation, for example, where we will see another competitor give you a flat rate and say, this is what you should do for the upgrade. And really what we've noticed with that is that it creates a really unhappy relationship to start between a partner and a client. Because quite frankly, there's a lot of complexity when we look at how you go through an upgrade with Dynamics AX to D365 that really needs to be considered. So the really first part of this that matters a lot is really what we would classify as our first step, right? Our base camp initiate type concept, where basically what we're trying to do are a couple of different factors with it. The first really is determining that overall vision for the future. So when you start looking at what you want to do to move to the next version of Dynamics, whether or not you're on AX 2009, 2012, RTM, R2, or R3, or even prior versions as well, really what you're looking for is what is the reason or vision for that future change that you want to have. And this topic is different by every single customer that we interact with. More specifically and pointedly, some people believe that the overall vision involves having more mobility in their business processes. Others feel that that vision is more about the ability basically to have a more modern platform to develop off of. And some look at all these different facets to really drive what that vision is going to be. I can't stress enough how really important that is in this process, because those outputs also determine kind of the pathing that you do with it. And really, as part of that vision exercise, what you should also be doing is really establishing that success criteria as part of this particular implementation or upgrade project. Obviously, success criteria can involve many different main points, right? So current functionality that's existing in D365, for example, is what you need to be successful. You don't need to have, for example, a dispatching system added on. Your functionality is not working and needs improvement. And so you identify, obviously, what those specific gaps are that are in, for example, your prior version that you think are going to be addressed with the future version as well. And then also, what are the additional changes that your business has gone through? So more specifics in terms of that functionality requirement that you may not have needed in the prior version, but maybe didn't even exist in that version as well. So that success criteria, you can kind of back up and just look at that from a business perspective point of view to start, without having technology as the real driver for those decisions. That's really a key point that I just want to identify here on this particular slide, is that success criteria doesn't necessarily need to be technology dependent. We at Stoneridge Software use technology as a tool, which means that you have a business process or challenge that you're facing. And what we want to do is we want to align the right Dynamics tool to be able to address that particular need. So for example, the upgrade might be needed to bring you more into a architecture that allows for us to use field service capabilities or Dynamics 365 field service, because that's one of your success criteria. You now have techs that are going out on site that you need to be able to take into account repairs that you're doing for your field service equipment that you may have. So that's really an important aspect here, is to really define that. The other aspect of this then, though, too, really comes to the operational perspective with it. So really identifying the team members that are part of that vision that was being generated. And those roles need to also be considered, obviously. The IT roles that are related to it, the PMO, your data analytics for the output in terms of what you're going to be reporting off of, the process designers, the subject matter experts that have that knowledge. Really what you're trying to do is document what that future vision is going to be and start preparing your team in terms of the vision team on what you're going to be doing here moving forward. And finally, obviously, the assembly of any documentation that you have to take into account what you've done in the past and why you've done it also helps drive what's going to happen in the future here, because that information is going to be used in the future as we go through this particular process. And the big thing about this is that there are opportunities for what we would classify as shortcuts. And that's that shortcut icon that we showed earlier for the symbol. Basically, if you have everything exactly the way it is, if you want to not do process improvement as part of that first iteration when you're going through an upgrade, that is one of the options that you have. Because what you could say is that, there are a lot of features from the platform perspective that we get with it, but in terms of the speed that we want to go through this process, we don't want to go through the analysis of what functionality or tools could be used other than maybe a high level demonstration of what those capabilities are. We want to do the upgrade as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And so that is another option that can occur, where we classify that basically as a shortcut that you can really use to go through and drive that particular process. So the other portion of this then, really, when we talk about what tasks or activities need to be tackled, and really what resources you need to start aligning then for the initiate phase. The one thing I want to stress with this is that there are different variations, obviously, of this depending upon the complexity of the project. But really what you're doing is you're establishing that vision, you're assembling the people that are required for that, and on the estimated effort here on the far right, we can see where we see a lot of effort that's really related to that. Some would argue the vision is the largest portion of it, but when it comes to the team at the beginning in terms of what the reasoning is for that, generally in terms of the project, it's a fairly small work effort to be able to tackle that. But the roles, as you can see, as we start looking at, for example, the project kickoff and also the documentation for those focus areas for process documentation and code documentation, really starts involving many more people as we go through this particular process. And then finally, the training as well and the freezing of code. There is obviously an impact on your existing system that needs to be considered when you go through this process by, for example, freezing code when you're going through an initiate process, because what you're trying to do is really ensure that you have a static environment as much as possible to reduce the risk of changes really causing that upgrade path to be jeopardized or to add risk with it. So this is really part of the initiate process that we talk about, or our base camp that we use to be able to tackle that. And the other thing to note here is that durations really can be longer than the total effort that you have. And what that means really is that, depending upon where you are in the process, that time may cause it where then all of a sudden, because you haven't established those success criterias, that people are basically spinning their wheels when it comes to figuring out what roles are related to it, right? So that's something to really understand, is that, the lag time between each of these processes that you start going through and identifying, for example, the assignment of roles. If you pause with that and then don't continue with it, that duration in terms of the work effort to re-pick that back up and to basically come back up to speed throughout this process can really vary and cause, even for us, for example, billing issues in terms of it takes more time now to do this. What we're really trying to say here is that when you start the initiate process, make sure that you're basically allocating the resources that you need to start executing this as a project. Don't do it where you're doing the exercise of initiate and then not moving on, because the cost of potentially then having to, reduce that workload and then increase the workload to catch back up again can be fairly significant as you go through that process. So once you've gone through really that base camp establishment with it, what we're looking for next really is the evaluation of the business processes. So we've assembled the team, we've gone through and really identified what the success factors are going to be in the vision that's related to it. We've got kind of the base documentation at least identified on where that was. Our next step is to really look at the business processes, and really the setup that we are tackling usually with this is to really start getting into the creation and generation of a D365 environment, for example. We want to get you in front of D365 as soon as possible, because there is a number of learnings that implicitly occur to you and your team by being able to log in and look at the solution. And when you look at, for example, AX 2012 compared to Dynamics 365, a lot of those concepts are the same, right? Because truly, it's technically an upgrade of AX 2012 R3, which was the first version of AX7, right? It came into that basically. So what we want to do is we want to set up that environment. We want to make sure that we have the ISV solutions or the current versions that are there as well, and really even start setting up sample data, because when we start going through the business process analysis, this really expedites those conversations then that we have with your team, because we're not talking about bicycles or speakers, for example, in demo data. We're talking about your real data as we go through this. And what we're trying to do with this is we're really focusing on the success criteria to be able to help determine the scope for this, right? So that success criteria that we talked about earlier really drives them what we're drilling down into in those particular business processes. We're looking at, for example, if you're using fixed assets and right now you're a manufacturer and you have machines that you want to manage really their repairs and things of that nature, well, that might be a process that could be significantly improved because we have a full enterprise asset management capability now within Dynamics 365. So what we're trying to do there is we're trying to identify those processes that are being handled manually or not as efficiently, inside of Dynamics AX. And we're trying to then identify what those next steps are going to be for you. And those could be by changing the process, it could be by implementing the process, or it could also be by changing the software and identifying at a very early stage what extensions need to be created or what customizations also need to be converted as part of that process. We're not really identifying right now during the business process analysis the core code portion of this. That's next, but we are identifying the processes because those processes may then have that code or data or those changes in the system to be able to support it. And what we want to do typically is try to get back to as stock as possible for your upgrade, because we want to ensure then that when you look at the long-term longevity of the particular solution of Dynamics 365, when they're doing updates every spring and fall, that we are minimizing the impact of what Microsoft can do in terms of when they do that platform upgrade, what you are able to basically then upgrade, because we don't want you to get into a position where you're version locked, obviously. And then lastly, what we're really looking at here is we're really looking at as well, not only the stock capabilities within Dynamics 365, but we're also looking at the ISVs to see what improvements that they have added to their solutions that maybe you created as a customization in the software, right, for that particular business process. So we're really working with you to identify that. And the other thing just to note here is that the setup, obviously, as we go through this particular process phase, really can be done concurrently, meaning that when we start the base camp or the initiate, as we call it in our process, we start setting up that environment, or we can immediately. Formally, we want to at least have it when we're going through the evaluation of the business processes, but at the same point, this can happen as we are going through the base camp process. And really a couple other key notes inside of here as well. First off, obviously, it really helps to compare a lot of these changes in a conference room with the team. So typically, what we're trying to do here in the business process analysis is that we're trying to be in a meeting room with the relevant subject matter experts with the software as quickly as possible, where we're going to have, and I'll show it in our next slide, 3 monitors or 3 views of what we're looking at, to be able to make intelligent decisions on the work effort that's going to be required based upon those changes. So, this is something that a lot of people overlook. I highly recommend it. It's part of our process that we classify as JPODs, which are joint process design sessions, where we're going through this process in an iterative manner. But the point is that we're trying to identify those differences immediately to really fixate on the scope and effort that's required required to be able to potentially convert those particular business processes or address them. And the other thing to note during this conversation is try to stay away from getting into the weeds. And it's the hardest thing I think that anyone has in the upgrade process, that they focus too much on the exceptions as opposed to the main process, or the critical process, or critical path process as we would call it. So be very careful with that. There's obviously an argument for the other side of that, meaning that the exceptions can drive, for example, 90% of the work effort that's related to it, but we want to document that. We want to understand that as part of that upgrade process. So make sure to stay away from the weeds for the exceptions that you know are not going to have a large impact on the resources, but documenting them, that's fine, right? We just don't want to get into the weeds with it. And remember, the more vanilla that we get to it, or the more stock that we get to the code inside of Dynamics 365, the better it's going to be for those upgrades that are occurring in the background. And we are very passionate about this. We don't want to cause problems with the organization, because that, for example, customization that you have in AX 2012 is your secret sauce. But at the same point, we want to ensure then that when we're looking at the spring and fall releases that Microsoft does for their release cadence, that those changes do not impact then that upgrade lifecycle. Because a lot of customers that are probably on this call as well, they're on AX 2012. I mean, that's 2012. We're in 2020 now at this point, right? That's an 8-year-old platform that you've been on theoretically at that point. So that's something just to note, is that we try to go through that process as we do this. The other thing here, I just wanted to highlight it. Here's the example. Documentation and notes on one monitor, the D365 vanilla with no modifications on it, and then your environment 2012 with ISVs is typically what we're tackling when we go through this process. And like I said, it really spurs a lot of conversations, because what we typically do is we review the documentation and notes, or at the beginning of the meeting, identify what those customizations are if you have that documentation. And if you don't, it's okay. We understand that. But what we try to then do is we go through the process in 2012, and then we try to reflect it inside of D365, right? And that really identifies then where are those gaps when we go through that. And that pre-work that you do helps you identify the level of effort and scope required then for really your upgrade process, and what path to really go down. And like I would stress before, any vendor that comes in, or any partner that comes in and tells you it's a flat fee for $150,000 to upgrade your environment, if they're not practicing this process, they don't know those changes. They can run some tools for code analysis, but it doesn't tell them why those code changes are there. So like I said, take some time to be able to go through this to really identify then what those core changes are. And really, like I said, this slide is here for you guys to be able to take back as well. But this identifies the activity and tasks that we go through for the environment setup, using lifecycle services, for example, as well, doing some of the checklists that Microsoft has in order to deploy the environment, involving the ISVs, and really the work effort that's related to all of this as well. And you can see that that lag time is there as well in terms of an ISV, right? We want to make sure that we're involving those ISVs immediately up front here as well, because if we start making decisions during this process and we don't have the ISV that you're using right now on D365, that could change or make some more rework or more iterations that we really have to go through with that. But this is just something to note in terms of typically what that work effort is going to be able to tackle that. And then finally, when we go through the processes as well, really what we want to do is we want to plan going through process walkthroughs. We want to see each of those processes that you're really running, and we want to conduct those while doing the comparisons. And that was in that conference room image that I gave as well. And then finally, what we're trying to do is we're saying what's in or out, right? What do we need to change? Those are really this is probably the largest portion of that pre-planning capability that you're looking at during it. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to front load the risk as much as possible, so that way when we're going through the decision points that we need to go to be able to determine what our next step is, obviously these are going to have a large impact on that. So once we've gone through all of that, obviously we've done our business processes. The next thing really is to go through and start examining the code. And this is my personal favorite because I'm a very technical individual by nature. But really what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to look at the code. So we've looked at the process. We've identified hopefully as much as possible the code that's there. But there's a lot of code that's used in the background in batch jobs or that's been designed from an integration point of view. And what we need to do is we need to be able to examine that information. So this is where we have a large variety in terms of prospects and clients that we interact with that have differences in terms of what they've really documented. Some of them would use Visual Studio Team Services in the past, or DevOps and TFS, and they've documented all their code and their changes very diligently and had fantastic release cycles, and it really expedites then that analysis. Others, and it's not atypical, it's actually pretty common. Others just implemented without having any type of documentation related to it, or the documentation is in code, right? So what we're trying to do here, though, is really identify then, though, what those changes are from a code perspective. So we're going to document the system changes that are there. We're going to take a look at those changes and see if they're associated, for example, with the supporting of a business process that we identified in step one, or if it was actually something that's not required potentially. So we're trying to identify the value of the code there, because one of the examples I love to give with this is with Microsoft when they moved from Dynamics AX 2012 R3 to AX7 for the initial release. They had around 500 reports, if I recall correctly, that were basically just duplicates with a different view that they were able to remove as part of their upgrade dev effort. And they basically then incorporated that into a current report that they had with a different view that they would run, or they would do some more of the modern concepts of Power BI as part of that as well. So what we're trying to do here is identify the value of that change, because every single piece of code that you need to move over is going to have a cost related to it on any of these paths that we go down. So something just to note is that we really want to see what that value is and really challenge that to be able to identify really what we need to move over with that. And then the other aspect here as well, as you probably know, with the new extension model, the overlaying concept that we used in 2009 and 2012, and basically since the inception of AX, changed to that extension model capability as well. So here is where we also want to look at the work effort related to it. Examples of that would be you've gone through and made core posting code changes. Well, in an extension model, you can't really make changes to the base code anymore. You can just basically connect to hooks, as we call them. So that evaluation in terms of how that process works and whether or not we have to refactor it or even potentially rewrite it also needs to be identified and discussed as part of that upgrade process. So when we start looking at this, obviously this portion of the code evaluation usually occurs with both code and analyze of data, right? We're kind of doing both at the same time because typically it's going to be two different teams that we have that are looking at this from our point of view. More specifically, code development, we're having conversations that'll have data output with it as well, but then we're looking at the data, the schemas, the custom tables that were added as part of that upgrade lifecycle as well, and we're really joining those together so we can gain some efficiencies as we go through that process. One of the poll questions that we don't have polls on here, but you can just go ahead and type it in chat at some point, really is how many code changes do you guys have in AX? It'd be interesting to hear from all of you kind of where you're at with that. So feel free to post. I've got a lot, a little, or any of that detail that you have as well. So the code analysis portion here then too, when we start looking at the activity and tasks with it, this is what you should be on the lookout for. There's a tool that the CAB report, as we would call it, that allows us to go ahead and basically analyze your environment to identify where custom code is. And really, I mean, there's a lot of different options that we have with that. Overlayering obviously separates that code as well in different layers. It makes it easy for us to be able to get that. But this tool puts it into a nice refined format that we can use then as part of our documentation effort. And so typically this is a small to medium effort because we have that tool along with the custom tools that we've created to extend that to be able to really get, what that work effort is going to be able to do that. We typically then take those changes and then really rate them high, medium, low as we go through that. And really that's where we start seeing a lot of that large effort occur, because these are a lot of conversations that have now peeled back the layer of the onion to the point where we're really looking at a lot of detail about this, right? So I can't stress enough with this. This can vary as well. We have it as a medium to large effort typically as we go through this. And that really depends as well on that supporting documentation on the point prior to that, right? Making sure if you have lots of documentation on that, you can reference what that object is, that class or that detail, and then we can look at it and then see, for example, why that was done and what business process it affects. Whereas if you haven't done that, we have to possibly marry that up, obviously, with our prior evaluation of your business processes to identify whether or not it's valid or not to carry forward. And then lastly, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to identify then those changes when we go through the code analysis to be able to identify then what we're bringing over and what we're not bringing over, and if there are opportunities to reduce then, for example, that code requirement. So that's a big thing just to note as we go through this. Kind of the next point that we typically go through then as well is going to be the analyzing of data, obviously. And so this is the perfect opportunity for some cleanup, right? And if you want to do cleanup or you don't want to do cleanup, that obviously can impact our pathing as we get to that. So this is where, I would say in a lot of ways, we verify a lot of the integrity of your data and the history and what you need moving forward to look up and tackle business processes that typically are pretty customer focused or even business reporting focused. And what I mean by that is that you think about it, a lot of customers, what they can do is they can say, for example, we're going to switch over into a new system and we're not going to carry any history. And what we can do for that history is we can actually have our team go back to the old AX 2012 system, for example, to look that information up. Or they create Excel files to be able to get some of the common transactions, or a Power App to be able to look up this information. So there's a lot of different options that we have to address that. But the core thing here is really identifying, for example, what you need and what you don't need to identify really the transactions or the support that you need from a finance perspective, from a customer facing perspective, basically documenting that. And so this I would say is harder for some clients to understand, because what they're expecting is an upgrade brings all the history, right? Well, an upgrade can bring all the history, but at the same point, remember that if there's a large amount of customizations that need to be refactored, for example, or rewritten, the same data structures that you used in the past may not be the same moving forward, which means that there are conversion efforts potentially that are required that go above and beyond, for example, a flat upgrade of table version A to table version B, because now we have new tables that are introduced because of the extension model that we have to use. So analyzing that data and the requirement for where you need that data is critical, and strategies then around what we can do to be able to tackle that are also very important. If you say to me, for example, that you need all of your GL history that you've had in the past and you can't summarize it, then you know what? You might not be able to go down, for example, the re-implementation path, because typically we don't want to take all that detailed transactional history and load it into a fresh new implementation, for example. So, those decisions that you make in the analyzing of your data really then drive that. And it's also the opportunity for you to instill change with it as well. So this is where you can, for example, if you're not using product dimensions and you really wish you would have, there might be an opportunity for you to start using product dimensions. So if you want size, style, or color, you could theoretically do that as part of that conversion process. And really, the big thing I want to stress here is that the modification of your master data and the intent of moving to, for example, product dimensions sounds simple, right? I just said it. It's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but it can be deceptively difficult. And what I mean by that, and I'm glad Paul put this point in here for this particular one, the juice is worth the squeeze. Remember, when you're going through this process, it's not only, for example, the product dimensions that you've changed to it. It might be the product history. It might be the on-hand inventory, the reservations if you're using that, the sales orders that are midstream that need to be converted, the production orders that may need to be impacted with it as well. There's all these different areas that can be impacted then by that. And I would say the number one area, if I had to look at our implementations or even our prior implementations that I've made in my past lives, data is where that scope explodes before you know it. So this is one thing just to understand, is that when you're looking at your data and the decisions of those outputs, make sure you're aligning with your partner to know what those cost implications are going to be and where those work efforts are going to be in terms of that conversion process and the impact in the system as you go through that. And when we look at the level of effort for this, obviously, the evaluation of the data integrity, I would say most of these are medium to medium large, right? So we're looking at the data integrity. We're trying to establish the volume, where 10,000 orders a day, 1,000 orders a day. We're trying to evaluate the master data and the fields that have been added to it that then drive, for example, that process data that you may have. For example, on customers, you may have added custom fields that are there that need to flow to a sales order. What is the requirement for that? We want to understand what that is, and what's that master data strategy around it as well. And really what we're trying to do here as part of that data process is identify, at the end of the day, the master data, the custom fields that are related to it, what processes are going to require conversion, what history you require in order to actually go through the upgrade process, and finally, what is the strategy for doing that cleanup or those data conversion activities as part of that upgrade lifecycle to really come to kind of what our next point is right here, which is really identifying the paths, right? We've talked for the last 37 minutes about all these different activities that you need to do that finally, in our minds, drive what path you're going to go down. Path 1, path 2, or path 3. And quite simply, path 1, classical upgrade. Path 2, kind of an upgrade, but maybe not. Maybe there's some opportunity areas in there, what we call a hybrid. And then lastly, depending upon where you are in your upgrade or where you are in terms of your current product, or even where you want to be with that vision, implementation, re-implementing. And we can talk through those here today just at a high level so that you can kind of understand that. So if you're on 2012 R2 or R3, you can really choose one of those three paths. The data and code upgrade, like I said, is really like a classical upgrade where you're just going through and doing a straight upgrade from 2012 R2 or R3 right to Dynamics 365. There's typically not as much, there's typically no conversions that are occurring with it. It's very rare to see this path. More commonly just because with customizations, there has to be a full change in terms of where that data is stored or how that is done. But there are tools in there, if you are more stock, for example, that we could go down that path to be able to do a data and code upgrade. The thing here just to note is that if you look at a data and code upgrade, if you have a lot of customizations, there may be a lot of customizations that you would have to refactor then for this as well. And that can also become expensive. So that's why we have these three different options. Now, when we look at the hybrid model, which is much more common, that is where we may have a lot of the migration tools that are used then to get to that version, but then we have custom processes that we've created then to, for example, populate custom fields from the data, almost like you would do with a brand new implementation. But because we have those base records, we just go through and just update or target then updates to specific data sets as an example with it. And that means as well that some of your code in your prior version won't port over because we've identified in the examined code lifecycle really what needs to move as part of that particular process. And then finally, there's the valid option of re-implementing. And a lot of people, at this point, they're like, well, wait. If I'm going to re-implement, why wouldn't I look at other solutions at that point as well? And the efficiency gain that you have by looking at a re-implementation, by using the same product, is pretty substantial. You think about concepts inside of ERP systems or business systems in general nowadays. You dimensions, you've got main accounts, all those concepts, for example, that you have in 2012 R3, they carry over into Dynamics 365. Those same exact concepts, the forms, the views that you have from an end user training perspective, there's a lot less effort that's required to go through that training life cycle compared to a new product. But at the same point, you get the advantage then of having total control in terms of your data and your code. And if it's a very large customized environment, you can actually save a pretty significant amount of money by going through a re-implementation process. So when we look at AX 2009 or 2012 R1, for example, or RTM as we would classify it, really there's not much of an option. You pretty much have to go through a re-implementation process. With 2012 R2 and R3, obviously we have these options. So like I said, if you're at 2009 or 2012 R1, it doesn't make as much sense as well to upgrade to 2012 R3 and then or even R2 and then go and upgrade that as well as part of the life cycle. Typically, it makes much more sense to go through obviously that re-implementation process, but knowing that you've got a lot of advantages in terms of those particular efficiencies that you're going to gain with it. And kind of finally here in chat, if you guys want, tell me what version you're using. I'd be interested in just seeing in our community here of how many different versions we have for the upgrade, and that obviously can help align to you one of those three paths as we go through it. And let's talk a little bit more about the 2009 and 2012. So if you are on 2009 or 2012, obviously we're not looking at an automatic upgrade path. We have to look at data migration and a code rewrite as part of this, right? That is part of that upgrade lifecycle. So if you're at those versions, that is something that we're going to have to tackle. And when we go through all those processes that we tackled before, though, what we want in mind more is obviously we have one path to choose from, which is really the re-implementation process with it. Now, on 2012 R2 and R3, we've got kind of an open book here, right, that we can do with it. We can do that code upgrade, we can do that hybrid, or we can re-implement as well. And really the output of the front end of this entire process will really establish what that work effort is going to be. So this is a great thing for our customers. Everyone's been really happy that we've been able to tackle then these three different initiatives, because quite frankly, they really drive our estimation with it. And when we go through that estimation, remember, we have different tools that we're going to then be presenting to you as part of this next step. If we do a true upgrade, really we've got, an upgrade, the upgrade estimate tool, which is that code tool that we were talking about, the car tool that we have. We've got our upgrade estimate worksheet that we'll be presenting to you, and then we'll establish what that project management time is to go through that. And when we do a hybrid, obviously the data migration becomes another core component in here. We both have code, but then we also have the ability to move data now in a different fashion than just using a true upgrade, for example. So typically we're identifying obviously that data migration estimate as well that identifies the migration per entity that we look at, and the testing and support along with the project management time. And then finally, with the re-implementation, what we're really recommending to our clients is to go through what we use is called a standard project estimation. And that's really based off of, we call an EPR, which is an enterprise process review. What that is that we've gone through the top layer to identify whether or not we can actually, whether or not we're going to go through a true upgrade or a hybrid, or if you're on a prior version, for example. And what we need to do now then for the re-implementation portion of this is really identify the work effort by business process and identify those business processes, inputs and outputs that are related to it. So we're going to recommend another life cycle here then for the estimate. We'll be able to give a high level estimate initially, but we want to refine that more because we're going to treat it more like a new implementation process, with the advantage that we have experience in AX for all the data conversion. So we've got a lot of efficiency gains there, and we also have a lot of efficiencies from an end user training perspective as well, as part of that process. So that's how we go through our estimation effort with it. And each of these, I'll just show them on screen here. We don't have to talk through it in a lot of detail. Really, we've got activities and tasks that we're going to set up with it. I would recommend to all of you on the call today that, if you're looking at doing an upgrade, the very first thing really is the prior to upgrade processes that you should be tackling. More specifically, getting DevOps set up, understanding what conference room pilots are going to be, getting your cumulative updates to the current version. I was on a call yesterday actually where we have one of our customers that's actually going through this, that they're getting to the current cumulative update to be able to address some performance-centric issues that they have, but also prepare them for the upgrade. So you're going to want to start doing that and really start setting up really, the environments and the planning and all that. That's that initiator base camp, right? That's kind of incorporated into that. When we look at, for example, then our upgrade path 1, these really are the work efforts that we have with it, right? We're going through the ISV install, we're doing our code upgrade, our data upgrade, and our testing before go live, right? So those are the core tasks that we look at then, with some variation, obviously, in terms of that code upgrade and data upgrade based upon how many customizations that you have and how those customizations need to be reworked to be able to convert that data as part of that upgrade path. But then when we start looking at our path 2, for example, with the hybrid, really what we're looking at here is that data migration can become, or even technically the code upgrade, can become much larger or smaller depending upon how much code we move forward or how much data we move forward as well. And I would really say that it's much more typical for a hybrid process to be tackled with our clients versus a flat upgrade or versus a reimplementation as well. But remember, the other portion of this is really the reimplementation portion of it. And that, as you can see, has more steps that are involved with it, because what we're really preparing for is a new version of software, because we might be changing core business processes, or we might be changing code or not porting code over, or redesigning basically how we do that particular business process. So we really, in this opportunity, want to look at then writing that, documenting it, identifying the work effort to it, doing the active development because we may not be reusing code, and really treating it like a new implementation. And I would say that this does happen on customer sites that have a large amount of customizations where we have not upgraded from 2009, for example, to 2012 R2 or R3. This is a very common path to go down, and it doesn't mean, once again, that it's more expensive. I just want to stress that. It really means that you are not looking at using the existing tools for data conversion, for example, but if you don't need 10 years of GL history, or you just need basic customers, you can actually start winning in terms of the cost here compared to any of the other paths as well. And really, the other thing that we want to identify here, obviously, is this is where we start putting together our DevOps dashboards, keeping track of cases and issues that we're interacting with. No matter what path we're going to, we want to start putting in these KPIs to be able to manage the upgrade process and the development that's going to be occurring with it. So a big thing to understand here is that if you're not using DevOps, you're going to want to start understanding DevOps and those capabilities, because that's what we use as we go through this process. And it allows for you to have a lot of visibility in terms of really what we're doing in terms of our upgrade process. And finally here, kind of the last things I want to go through really are just, after the upgrade, right? So, we've gone through and what happens then when you go through the go live process with it. And what I want to stress here is that we have a checklist that you typically go through here, whether or not we're doing an upgrade, whether or not we're doing the hybrid approach, or whether or not we're doing an implementation process, where we're basically going through and identifying all the actions and activities that are needed to move from an on-prem based solution, which you currently have now, maybe hosted is what you have, but the point is that we now are online with Microsoft Managed Services, right? And we have a checklist on how we go through this deployment process of updating the go live date, of making sure that we've got the right production deployment request in there, making sure that we've got our package ready for deployment because we need to deploy our data conversion packages and also our code packages as part of this upgrade process. And we also need to copy the sandbox database that we've been testing off of and basically ensuring then that we're tackling all these cutover activities. The reason I want to show you this is that obviously this is critical. This is when you go live, because now we have multiple people that are responsible for this. And the point here is that we have a lot of experience around this. We've identified who's responsible for those particular areas and what external parties may also be involved with it. And we generally talk about this and we're planning with this really as part of our entire upgrade lifecycle. So it doesn't just stop after we've gone through, determined the paths and done all this code and data upgrade that occurs. We're also trying to ensure then as well that moving forward, that when we do this cutover, that everything has been tried and true and tested, and we're not scrambling as part of the upgrade life cycle to be able to then tackle things that potentially could have been missed as part of that process. And where does that lead us to right here? Congratulations. Look at those happy campers right there. I know that the journey sounds big, right? This is an hour that we've talked a lot about details in terms of code, business processes, and data. But the key thing here that we want to stress is that Stone Ridge has done this multiple times. Our team knows how to go through this process. We are always there to be able to help you throughout this. We're part of that particular journey, and that means as well that we're identifying upfront how much we're involved or how little we're involved as well, because some customers have full dev teams and just really need an architectural guidance to go through this particular journey or process. Either way, what we have seen with our customers that have made this transition is that the benefits are fairly substantial. Being able to use Power Apps and Power Platform and Power BI and all the extended capabilities in Dynamics 365, such as field service, IoT capabilities, machine learning. I mean, these are concepts that we talked about 3 years ago that were really bleeding edge, that are becoming much more common day in and day out. And the organizations that endorse those are definitely seeing a very large positive influence really on their bottom line and on their efficiencies to be able to grow and scale.